Hello chaps, today we're talking about the First World War. Being honest, the First World War isn't that significant in this little history of farming we're constructing. There is a decline in the countryside, interrupted by World War I, but then afterwards the decline continues in line with where it was before the war. World War II is much more important, as there's some pretty radical stuff going on that completely changes the situation, which is why this chart looks like it does. But we will talk about farming in the First World War because it establishes a model of wartime farming that's repeated in the Second World War. Here's the situation when we're at war with Germany. We live on an island called Britain. We have an industrial population far larger than what our soil can support. We rely on food imports from abroad. Those imports come on boats which can be sunk. The Germans have submarines, and our bodies need food, and without it we die. Most of this is true in peacetime, actually. In 1914, we were absolutely reliant on food from abroad. About 60% of what we ate was imported. But we couldn't get it from Europe, as Europe looked like this, and had lots of hungry people in it shooting at each other. In the 2 years after July 1914, food prices rose 61%, and the 1916 harvest was bad. The government hadn't been very interested in farming since the repeal of the Corn Laws some 60 years earlier, and they didn't want to do anything invasive in agriculture because farms were property, and that would be standing on the toes of the freedom-loving Englishman. That would be tyrannical, and it had never been done before. So instead they do the opposite of what was sensible and conscript 170,000 farmers and farm labourers and requisition 500,000 horses for the army. This poster from Ireland, which was part of the UK at this point, is targeting farmers specifically, asking them to sign up. So the government takes expertise and manpower and horsepower from the land and send it to the continent. A bit silly, to be honest. They're also reluctant to be invasive on the consumer end. They encourage people to eat less food, eat less bread. Very simple messaging. The Americans use similar posters. And they ask bakers to sell bread by weight, not by loaf, and they demand that it's left to go a bit stale before it's sold to make it less appetising. This is what the government is comfortable with, encouraging people, not rationing yet. But this strategy would only work if food kept coming in from abroad. The 1915 Milner report mentioned in the last episode wanted the government to initiate a plough-up campaign to increase food production here. Converting grassland to cereals would provide more calories per acre than pasture-fed meat production. Ploughing up grassland would become central to farming while at war with Germany. But it takes them a little while to figure this out. The Milner report only gets the attention it deserves many months after it's published, when the Germans start sinking ships in the Atlantic with their submarines. But in 1915, the government do take some steps towards a more proactive approach. They established the War Agricultural Executive Committees, or War-Ags as they become known, which were county-based organisations linked to the government and county councils. The War-Ags would help farmers with scientific advice and distributing resources, but they would also tell them what to do. So this is the beginning of a lean towards a push for food production, which was just as well, because in February 1917, the Germans started sinking lots of ships in the Atlantic with their submarines. So the government had to do something. Lloyd George is now the Prime Minister, and a new food production department is created explicitly to control, organise and distribute resources. And they already have the War-Ags, so the government's approach becomes much less flexible. It's a sort of carrot and a stick. The 1917 Corn Production Act gave farmers minimum prices, so they had the economic security that they needed to dust off their ploughs and plant crops. But the government also demanded productive farming. For example, this mildly threatening notice from the War-Ag tells farmers that docks, thistles and ragwort must be destroyed as soon as possible, and invites them to snitch on each other. A fine of £20 sounds chill, but in today's money that's about £1,155, and after 40 years of economic depression in the countryside, a lot of people would have struggled to pay that. The government aren't messing about with this. And then they start implementing all of the agricultural policies that are repeated in the Second World War, which you've probably heard of. The government buys lots of Fords and tractors because they sent all of the horses to France. They have metal wheels. Virtually all of the tractors produced by Ford were brought by the Ministry of Munitions, which was run during the war by Lloyd George and Winston Churchill, so mechanisation in farming gets government endorsement from some pretty big fish. January 1917 sees the Women's Land Army founded. 23,000 women served in the First World War under the leadership of Mary L. Talbot from the Board of Agriculture and Fisheries. It's a civilian organisation, part of the National Service Scheme. Farming back then involved lots of labour at certain times of year in gathering the harvest or weeding with hoes or threshing grain. So these Land Army recruits were often organised in labour gangs that would move together from farm to farm doing threshing or whatever other job they were trained for. There's not really very many land girls in the First World War, but the idea was there. War with Germany, means get women from the towns and send them into the countryside. They also introduced rationing cards, but they're still reluctant to use them. The framework is there just in case. Up until early 1918, they're still encouraging people to eat less voluntarily. Pamphlets were distributed saying, "We must eat less. Think of the sacrifices our gallant boys are making." But by the end, they do ration the important stuff like milk and butter and meat. And not playing ball is a criminal offence, so the government is prepared to be invasive by the end of the war. And basically, that's it. It's taken the course of the First World War to figure it out, but by the end, the government knows what the food system should look like while we're at war with Germany. Home production of food, a plough-up campaign making the land more productive by replacing old grassland with cereal crops, guaranteed prices giving farmers economic stability, but also the War-Ags to enforce the government's conception of good farming, a women's land army and rationing on the consumer end. But perhaps most importantly, by the end of the First World War, all this stuff has already been done. So the government isn't quite as reluctant to be invasive come the Second World War. There is already a precedent for this type of action. But after the war, these measures supporting agriculture were repealed, so it doesn't really change the trajectory of things. Much more important are the death duties mentioned in the last episode, because that makes everybody get really angry at each other between the wars. Between the wars, the scientists argue with Lord Lymington and his friends about the problem of poverty in the countryside and what is to be done about it. It is Lymington. I pronounced it wrong in the last episode, which is slightly embarrassing. Thank you for the chap who pointed it out. I've read a lot about this guy, but I've never actually heard anyone else pronounce his name, which is a place. So there we have the correct pronunciation of a British place name fooling even a native. One of the reasons the repeal of wartime measures supporting farming was politically possible was that farmers were considered to have a good war. Before the war, they were impoverished, but after the war, they were doing all right, which didn't make them very popular. I couldn't find an image to illustrate this social friction, but it's mentioned in a podcast in my sources, and I do believe it. People seen to profit from war are generally not popular. Lumping farmers in with the capitalists benefiting from war is an interesting foreshadow of current perceptions of farmers, where they're lumped in with the planet-destroying multinational corporations, but we haven't gotten to that bit just yet. And before I go, I just wanted to moan briefly about the standard of journalism about this period. Don't believe everything that you read. This article says that they send 500,000 horses to the front, which is a statistic so often repeated that I have felt comfortable repeating it myself. But then it says they use more horses, even though they have less. And these bigger ploughs enabled some farmers to harvest 16 acres in one day instead of 6 acres. We covered ploughing some time ago on this channel. All ploughing does is turn soil upside down. It has nothing to do with harvesting. The person who wrote this article clearly doesn't even have a basic understanding of agriculture, which is what we're trying to combat on this channel, but I thought I'd just share this with you because it really is an outstanding piece of nonsense. Thank you for watching. I promise all this is going somewhere. In a couple of episodes it becomes about the birth of the environmentalist movement, which is something we need to think critically about if we're going to actually solve the problem of climate change. So do stick around.
Up to mighty London came an Irishman one day. As the streets are paved with gold, so everyone was gay, singing songs of Piccadilly, Strand and Leicester Square, till Paddy got excited, then he shouted to them there. It's a long way to Tipperary, it's a long way to go. It's a long way to Tipperary, to the sweetest girl I know.